Hello and welcome to Faith Talks. In today's program, we'll be exploring the topic of suicide and faith. Joining me in the studio today are Patrick Johnson, a pastor, and Tabitha Purpo, a youth pastor. Welcome to the show. Suicide. Why do you think people commit suicide?
My experience, and it started off as working as a nurse. I worked on a ward where we would every Friday clear out as many beds as possible because we knew for the weekend we'd be having a lot of people coming in that were attempting suicide. So it was an acute medical ward, and so that was the case. I mean, every Friday evening, Saturday night, we had lots of people coming in who'd taken tablets, done all kinds of things, constant flow. Why do people commit suicide? It's often associated with depression and a feeling of, I can't cope anymore. That was my experience with it.
What about you as a youth pastor? How do you come across, or have you come across suicide, and why do you think people commit suicide?
My first experience of suicide was a member of my own family, and having to call the ambulance and go in the ambulance alongside somebody and sit in the hospital and really just be there. Waiting to find out, and with the doctors putting a lot of pressure on me to find out what they had taken at that point. And it was then that it really became something that leapt off from just theory. Like, you know, you'd read that young people do this, and I was a young person, and I knew that this was happening amongst other people, but that was the first time that I'd had any experience of that. And so from there on in, it's been a case that I've always tended to come into contact with suicide in that context of having to be with somebody who's actually done that, and then going out and dealing with the family as well. So the challenge is to kind of bridge that gap between the person who's lost all hope, which has been my experience of why they've done what they've done. They've lost all perspective and all hope, and as you said, it's the depression that sinks in, and other mental health factors come in. And then the family who have no understanding of why that's happened. And so that's been my experience of dealing with suicide, and why suicide, in my experience, has occurred. It's that aspect of no idea or no hope or a loss of something in them. Something, you know, you can see it, something has almost died before they've physically tried to take their life. So, yeah.
People would argue that to come to that stage of hopelessness or that deep depression, surely that is people who have no faith or do not have God in their lives. How would you respond to such a statement?
No, I think as we get to understand what depression is all about, we realize that it's not necessarily connected to your faith at all. I just read recently an article on where some research was done into people who were suffering from deep depression and their faith and what spirituality they had. And the descriptions that they come with of that feeling of complete hopelessness, being in like a black hole where you can see no light whatsoever, where even a feeling of God, it's like he's cut off totally. And that's when often the escape of suicide is the only way in which you can be quit this oppressive feeling all the time. It's no wonder it would come at that stage. So it was really quite insightful to just enter the world of people with depression, and to just grasp a little bit of what it is that they're going through. It's not because you have lack of faith. There can be all kinds of reasons why people go through depression. So I think as we understand that more, maybe we should be having a lot more sympathy with people who are going through depression.
Don't you find on that note that actually faith can compound it? Because what happens is you feel so much guilt. And if you're from a faith community where depression or mental health issues aren't spoken about, or are seen as something that everybody else suffers from, and Jesus will just heal you from that because he wouldn't allow your mind to be taken that way, because you've got to be in a right mind to make those choices. That hole becomes even bigger because you know that God exists, but you have no way of interacting with those who are around you, because they will not, in your mind, understand what you're going through, because they can't make that leap between this black hole that you're sitting in and the God that we serve, and they find that so difficult. So then the feelings of guilt, the feelings of isolation, the feelings of being cut off and hopelessness become even more magnified, because you do have faith, because you do come from that background, and because you feel even more isolated from all of those people around you, and it becomes that kind of one on top of the other, just piling it all in. And that's, I think it makes it even worse.
It's interesting you say that, because that can be the case. In this study, what they found was people who had a faith of some sort, it actually helped prevent them going too far. Because for some of them, because they believed in a God, they thought, well, if I do this, it will displease God, so I better not.
Yeah.
So it kind of had that effect as well. So there is that aspect to it too. I hear what you say and I agree, but it can have a preventative effect as well, to a certain degree.
So faith definitely has a role in that discussions around suicide as well. But I think, Tabitha, it was interesting what you were saying as well, that people around the person in the faith community were so distant from understanding the disparity of the person contemplating suicide. How are we as a Christian community dealing with the concept of suicide? How have we dealt with that in the past?
Silently, really quietly. I don't know about anybody else, but I feel it's just, unless your community is literally touched by it, so one of your young people or one of your members, or a father figure or a mother figure goes through that, the community tends not to have in any interaction. That's been my experience of working in different youth settings, is that unless somebody actually comes to the forefront, normally a prominent person who has a suicidal moment or does manage to succeed at committing suicide. And there is a difference. There are people who attempt suicide, and those are people that succeed at committing suicide, and that has a very different effect on the community. And when you have those, then the community will struggle through it. They will battle through those questions. They will challenge themselves to figure out where they're going, did they go wrong, and ask themselves all of those kinds of questions which everybody would ask. But unless you have that, mostly we're quiet. Mostly that is the silent, we don't talk about that.
But you're still talking about people then doing some soul searching and some self-reflection afterwards. Yet there's a lot in history. We know that people who committed suicide were not allowed to be buried in sacred ground, so they were not allowed to be buried in churchyards. And that concept still seems to prevail a little bit, that there's a thought pattern that Christians who do commit suicide have lost God and are not going to be forgiven, but are going to be forever in damnation. Patrick, why do you think so many Christians still hold on to that? We've talked about mental illness, but this other thought pattern is still very prominent.
The main way in which we as Christians approach ethical questions has to do with asking the one question, is it right? So when it comes to all ethics, that's our number one question. And in order to ask that question, you need to think of, what are my sources for what is right and wrong? And of course, the Bible would be that for Christians. So we would look at the Bible and say, well, what does the Bible say about this? It says you should not kill, or don't murder. And killing yourself being the ultimate murder, never being able to ask for forgiveness after that, then, that person's in serious trouble. And I guess that really lies at the basis of why Christians have reacted the way they have, asking that question. Now, I think it's the wrong question to ask, but I think as an explanation, that really lies as a foundation for why we reason the way we do.
Why do you think it's the wrong question to ask?
Well, there are other ways of reasoning ethically as well. Another very popular way is to do the maximum good for the maximum amount of people. but that doesn't really help within the suicide question. The way in which I think we should deal much more with ethical questions is that of virtue. Who do I want to be? Who do we want to be as a community? If that's the question we ask, then we approach it differently. You know, and you see this often if you read the Bible and read the New Testament in particular. You have the religious leaders who are always asking, is this right? Now, what is it that Jesus always does? He doesn't answer the is it right? He's basically saying, so what kind of person do you want to be? So, for example, they would talk about Sabbath. Is it right to heal on the Sabbath? But he says, but do you want to do good or not? Yeah. So he's talking about a virtue kind of ethic, whereas they're talking about a kind of is it right or wrong kind of ethic. And so if you want to be a virtuous person, a person who is full of love, who is good, who is humble, and those kind of virtues, then you approach things completely differently. And then all of a sudden the question of suicide isn't about is it right or wrong, but how should we be as a community towards these people?
And I think we might be stuck more in the right or wrong because we are very obsessed with other people's right and wrong, it seems, also in our Christian denominations. But is suicide biblical? I mean, because if we are looking at all the examples in the Bible, you know, looking at them to live a virtuous lives, does suicide even exist in the Bible, Tabitha?
Yeah, there are 8 cases of suicide in the Bible, and so it does exist, but there is no reference of God actually speaking on suicide. So there's a very distinct difference of how it's spoken about. So when we talk about the text in Exodus where we begin to talk about the commands and it's do not kill, it doesn't actually talk to suicide specifically. There's no real command about it. But what we see is there are a number of examples, and there are some very famous ones. Samson, he at the end of his life is stood underneath 2 pillars and he looks up and he realises the glory of God and he realises all the things that he's missed in his life and suddenly realises, oh, this is what I was supposed to do. And he pushes those pillows down in prayer and kills himself as a byproduct of killing all of those above. You have cases where kings have fallen on their swords and their servants have fallen on their swords. They were about to be captured. The whole world was about to be tortured and they were going to die painful death without reference to God, so to speak. And so it's best I fall on my sword. We have one example which always makes me smile of a man who had fallen in battle and a woman had pushed something off of a rooftop, and he says to the servant, come and kill me lest it be told that I was killed by a woman. Yeah. So yeah, this really thing. But the one that strikes me that probably speaks to what we're talking about today in a modern context is Judas. Because Judas experiences that hopelessness. And we can see from the story of Judas when he gets into that garden and he stood on that plot of land that he is in a black hole. He's so deep into that black hole that he has forgotten every word that Jesus said. He can't remember the words of comfort. He can't remember that there's something else. All he can see is this blackness that he feels he has created, and he dies that day. And therein lies the challenge, because that's when you look at it and go, hold on a second, does Judas make it to heaven? What happened to Judas's soul? And that's really where the virtuous side of us comes out, because that's really when we're going, is it right or wrong? Or are we looking at him saying, what happened to Judas? What happened to that person's whole being? How can we help all of those to be remembered differently? And so that's where you get that kind of whole spectrum of suicide in the Bible. But God himself never actually says anything to suicide. They are mentioned, but he doesn't actually speak to it. And that's why I think the black and white thing comes out so much, because we, as Christians and as people generally, just want to be told what's wrong and right. We almost revert to being 3-year-olds again. It was all really simple when you're 3. You know, mum said do this, and if you did this, you got a gold star, and if you didn't, all the stars were taken away. It was really simple, and it's very easy to manage. But when you get to be an adult, and that's the struggle of a teenager, suddenly there's this massive grey spectrum of life where if I do this, well, I'll get a little bit of trouble, but then I might not get trouble because this might happen. And okay, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And there comes that challenge of who do I want to be? Where do I want to find myself? And when we talk about suicide and the families that are dealing with that and the communities that are dealing with that, they are the ones that have to do that deep soul searching, because they're the ones that challenge, like, hold on a second, but I loved that person. Who do I want to be? I love them. I don't want to hear the black and white answer now. That is not helping me. And sometimes people want to hear it because actually it gives them comfort to just hear they were wrong, it was a wrong thing to do, and I'm vindicated because they were wrong, and I can hold on to that.
And then the blame doesn't come back. I could have done something.
Yeah.
Maybe I could have been more helpful, or been serving the person. Because how do you deal with their families after suicide has been successful? You know, it's such a strange word to use. But after somebody has actually killed themselves, how do you deal with that? Have you ever had to bury somebody who's committed suicide?
I've not actually had to bury anyone. I have been in the funeral of someone, actually, within my family. So yeah, I've been part of that whole process there. Of course, the relatives are left behind thinking, why? There's that first of all, and then there's the blame. Oh, why do they take the coward's way out? This often comes out. And there's this kind of, I cannot understand why. Yeah. And that is really the case, because we don't understand people's mind, what was going on before they would do something like that, why they would go to that kind of a stage. And for me, you know, it really is a matter of saying, well, we don't know. All I know is we serve a loving God. That really is the bottom line, really. And He's the one who knows what was in that person's heart. He's the one who from all intents and purposes, what we see in the Bible, He's a whole lot more gracious than we even dare to think. So I kind of
give Him credit for.
Indeed. So I am a lot more hopeful when it comes to these things. You know, I remember one case. Now, she wasn't Christian, but when I was a nurse, and this one lady that came onto this ward, she actually was a nurse tutor, okay? So she knew what kind of tablets to take and when to take them, and she took a whole heap of them. She was going to end her life, going through a depression. Fortunately, her husband came home earlier and found the empty bottles. She's there, got her into, you know, the ambulance, came to our emergency ward, and we worked hard to save this lady, and we saved her. And it was so great, because I remember the day she left the hospital, she came around, she gave us this huge, warm hug, and she said, "Thank you for saving me." Now, before, she definitely wanted to die. Now, being given life again, she was really glad, because she'd now come through whatever it was.
Yeah.
And so, you know, if she had been successful, we'd all have thought, well, you know, what was it? But having been saved, she was very grateful for life. So, you know, maybe on the resurrection morning, God resurrects a lot more people than we realize, and they'd be saying, "Thank you for giving me life again."
That's a really good illustration as well, and I think that kind of alludes to that you think that people are going to be in heaven even though they've committed suicide.
I do. You know, when the Bible mentions Samson in the Hall of Faith that we have in the book of Hebrews, it tells me God, you know, as Jesus says, God looks at the heart.
Yeah.
We can only look at the outward stuff and wonder, but He sees what's going on in people's hearts, and He knows a whole lot more, and He's much more understanding.
And I also think that God saves by grace. And as Patrick said, we only touch on what grace is. And I think sometimes we think, oh, well, grace is only extended to all of the good choices we make, or the times when we can say sorry. But actually, grace is at its most when we can't, when we aren't able to do the things for ourselves. And grace extends far beyond all of those choices. It extends to something completely different. So for me, when I look at, you know, the young people and that I've come into contact with who have attempted suicide, who've gone through that process, and the families who've been touched by suicide, where they've lost somebody, I know that grace exists much more than we can ever comprehend. And it is from a loving God God didn't create us to lose us. He created us to fight for us every single step of the way. And even in our darkest moments, in that black hole where you may have given up and just said, I can't fight this anymore, God has grace for that. That's something different.
I don't know if you've ever thought about the death of Jesus, which is really significant for us as Christians. What was his struggle? He knew he was going to die. It's almost suicidal. Yeah? He was going to put himself in the place where he was going to get killed. He didn't go elsewhere. He could have done that. And his struggle was,
I can call the angels. Yeah.
Because he said, I could just call 12 legions and be finished with this rubbish, yeah? But he didn't. He went through that. So for in a sense, and I'm not trying to excuse, this way of going, but that was part of what Jesus experienced. Some of what a person who must go through those kind of thoughts goes through.
A very interesting observation. I hadn't thought of it that way before. I think both of you have touched on families and the support system and the faith community around the person who is trying to commit suicide, and you shared an incident in the hospital setting. How do you think as a faith community we can be more supportive when people are in that disparity of a black hole that they can't get out of and they are contemplating suicide? What are some of the signs you should look out for perhaps? But how as a faith community can we come around and be of support? Or should we just give up?
Oh no. I think we should acknowledge it's real. I think 2 weeks ago I was invited to somebody's home for lunch, and they're the parents of the teenagers. So we had lots and lots of very loud, lively teenagers in one room and lots of parents grilling me in another room because I work with the loud and lively teenagers. And one parent said, out of the blue, we're all sitting talking, playing a game, and then out of the blue, do you think depression is real? Because I really don't think it's real. And I stopped. And we happened to have a few nurses in the room, some who'd worked in mental health hospitals and had experienced suicide and a colourful spectrum of mental health issues. And I looked back and I thought, oh no, you're being serious. And I was really surprised because the person who asked me was a nurse. But they dealt in the occupational health side of things, where they dealt with people who were going through sadness. And maybe were being overprescribed or weren't actually being dealt with properly. And for them, their experience meant depression is not real. This is not a real thing. This is like a Western problem. If you go, and the classic, if you go to somewhere with real problems, you won't feel like that. And as I sat and pondered this, I realised that actually there was a real lack of understanding, real lack of genuinely, you can't liken a person's struggle to someone else's. You can only deal with what they are going through. You cannot say to somebody, that's not real or that's not a real problem because there are people starving. It's a real problem. You have to acknowledge that it is a real and honest, genuine problem for the individual. And in dismissing it, you are creating a further complication. And so I think the first step for any community is to acknowledge that these things are real and they are real problems for real people who have real struggles. And if you don't acknowledge that, you are denying them a human face, human contact that Jesus gave us to do. And how can you do something like that? How could you possibly want? And it goes back to your question of being virtuous. Is that really the kind of person you want to be?
Exactly. And I think that's exactly the point. We as church communities, we need to be saying to people, we acknowledge that you are going through what you're going through. We don't dismiss it. We had a program at our church a few months back with a few people who have had various different types of mental health issues, and they were telling their stories. And it's as you hear what people go through, then you understand more. And I think we need to be able to do that in our faith communities a little bit more. Tell those stories so people can enter your world and get a little glimpse of it. Because it's so easy for me from where I'm sitting everything's fine, and think, well, come on, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, kind of thing.
Just brush it off, you'll be okay.
Exactly. But whereas when you hear what a person's gone through, then you say, oh, now I kind of grasp it a little bit more. And this study that I just told you I read about, it was really interesting just to hear the words that people use to describe the depression and what it's like. And then you're able to a little bit to enter into their world. And so we want to be a community that says, okay, we hear you, we understand you, we are going to support you, and just be here for you.
And I think that sounds really good, what both of you are saying. But yet, if somebody commits suicide, it must be because they're not experiencing that lovely community that you're describing.
Not necessarily.
I was going to say.
Not necessarily. That hasn't been my experience at all. I think that, as painful as it is to even begin to understand, the reason that somebody commits suicide is their reason, and they can be experiencing all the love in the world and still commit suicide because they've come to the end of their journey, and that for them is the end. And you can't know what that is. You can only be thankful that they experienced the love that they did, and by not giving that to them. And I've had one family I know who their young person committed suicide, and what should have been the worst experience of any family came back and said thank you to the church community they were attending, because they said, I know that they felt loved where they were. I know that they experienced that, and I'm grateful that you gave them that before they died. And that's when you just sit there and think, okay, something different's going on here. They experienced that love, they experienced that touch of Jesus, and they've passed. And now the family are beginning to deal with all of the guilt and the questions that they have surrounding that. But it's not necessarily the case that it doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, you can't take on the responsibility of somebody else's decision. So we want to save everyone, but you can't always. And in the end, it is that person's decision. You can just have done what you can. And if you've been that kind of loving, supportive community, then you have done what you could. But some, for whatever reasons, even with Jesus, people walked away. With a guy like that, you kind of wonder how is that possible. But that can happen. And so, we do lose some.
Well, I want to say thank you to both of you for being in the studio today. And why not add your voice to the debate by joining us on our Facebook page at Faith Talks. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next time.